So thank you for coming to our session. So I'm going to be presenting, looking at a summary of the evidence for whether HIV prevalence is decreasing in India and look into possible reasons for that decrease. And I'll be mainly presenting work of other people, which I'm very grateful for, especially the HIV prevalence trends were all collected as part of the National AIDS and Control Organisation in India. So has HIV prevalence decreased in India? So when we look at the Indian sentinel surveillance, which collects data from antenatal women and high-risk groups, and they collect data from about 250,000 women each year and about 100,000 high-risk individuals. The data suggests that there's declines in HIV prevalence in all groups for 2003 to 2010. And there's similar declines among sex workers, men who have sex with men, and antenatal women, and a smaller decline in injecting drug use. And when this data is used to produce trends of HIV prevalence amongst the overall Indian population, using methods developed by the UN reference group, then that suggests there's been a decrease in prevalence by about a third from 2000 to 2011. Now these estimates average trends over contrasting states in India, and India is a large place, so it's important to consider whether these trends are different in different places, whether we're masking some places it going up and some going down. So when we look at the change in HIV prevalence at the state level, we find it's highly correlated to baseline HIV prevalence. So what we have in this figure is we have the change in HIV prevalence from 2003 to 2011 for either antenatal women on the left graph on the vertical axis or among sex workers on the right graph, and we look to see how that's related to HIV prevalence in 2003. And we find that the HIV prevalence has decreased in most places, but it's decreased in all high prevalence districts, but not in all low prevalence districts. And we find that there's larger decreases in states with higher HIV prevalence in 2003. Now I was quite surprised by these sort of correlations, and I think it sort of possibly suggests there might be some sort of effect of epidemic stage at those places with the high HIV prevalence could be in the declining phase of an epidemic, whereas those in the low HIV prevalence may be in an increase in epidemic phase. However, I don't think this is the full reason for these declines. So why has HIV prevalence decreased in these places? There's been a number of analyses that have looked at this, and they've mainly looked at it in southern India, where there's been sort of concentrated key population interventions, and I'll present some of the data from this. So firstly, there's been a number of statistical analyses. The first analysis I sort of present here looked at HIV prevalence within integrated biobehavioral surveys undertaken in 24 districts in 4 southern states. And they looked at the change in HIV prevalence between those rounds of those surveys between 2004 and 2009. And they found that HIV prevalence decreased by nearly a half over that period. And also, importantly, I think that syphilis also decreased over that period, and high titer syphilis also decreased, suggesting that it couldn't all be due to a change in epidemic phase, but there's also probably a decrease in sexual risk. The analysis also considered whether the declines in HIV prevalence at the district level was related to program coverage, and they found that it was. So those with higher intervention coverage had higher decreases in sex work HIV prevalence. And when we look at the relation between intervention outcomes and condom use, we also found similar trends, that those places with higher intervention coverage also had larger increases in condom use, giving a sort of causation process where intervention coverage increases condom use, which then decreases HIV prevalence. So the second analysis I considered here looked at the changes in HIV prevalence amongst antenatal women. And it looked at the district level, it looked to see whether those districts that had a higher level of investment for key population interventions had a larger decrease in HIV prevalence. And they found that this was the case. So that basically, if those districts that had invested more in key population interventions had a larger decrease in ANC HIV prevalence. How it's important to note that this doesn't really fill in the causation pathway. So it doesn't look into whether those with the higher investment had higher outcomes in terms of the key population interventions. Did they reach more, say, sex workers? Did they distribute more condoms? And it didn't look to see whether those were the places which achieved greater increases in condom use or greater decreases in HIV prevalence within the sex workers. So the third analysis here also looked at ANC HIV prevalence trends amongst women at the district level and looked to see whether there was a larger decrease in ANC HIV prevalence amongst those with a high intensity Avahan intervention compared to those without the high intensity Avahan intervention. And they also found a negative association. So those districts which had the Avahan intervention, which was a large-scale intervention for key populations, they had a higher decline in HIV prevalence. However, it's important to note in this analysis that the control non-Avahan districts also had a decline in HIV prevalence, and that the decline caught up with the non-Avahan district, with the Avahan districts. And this had the same problem as in the previous analysis, that it didn't consider the causal pathway. The fourth analysis also looked at this in a similar way, but it had a number of additional strengths to it. In addition to looking at decreases in HIV prevalence, it also looked at decreases in syphilis prevalence, and it also looked at not just the spending on sex worker interventions, but it also looked at whether the number of STIs treated among sex workers, the number of sex workers reached, or the number of condoms distributed was also related to the decrease that you get in the ANC prevalence. And for the HIV outcomes, they only found that the number of STIs treated in sex workers was related to the decrease in HIV prevalence. Whereas when they looked at the decrease in syphilis prevalence, they found that all attributes were related to the decrease in syphilis prevalence in ANC women. So there's also a number of model analyses that also add to the picture of what caused these decreases in HIV prevalence in southern India. So these were model analyses that were done to evaluate the Avahan intervention, which was an intervention reaching high-risk groups in southern India. And the first analysis that I think adds to this story is an analysis that looked to see whether HIV transmission was driven by sex workers in India, which it showed it was, and then following a subsequent analysis which used a Bayesian framework to look whether declines in HIV prevalence amongst sex workers could be explained by natural disease dynamics, or is it likely due to additional increases in condom use among sex workers. Now, the model showed that it was likely due to an intervention effect and not due to natural disease dynamics. And then, importantly, those model projections also predicted a substantial decrease in HIV transmission overall due to this intervention effect, as shown here. And when we looked at the subsequent declines in prevalence in the general population, the models suggested that due to the intervention in the key populations, you got subsequent predicted declines in HIV prevalence in the overall population, which were also consistent with ANC prevalence trends in those districts. So in conclusion, evidence suggests that HIV prevalence has decreased in most states and population subgroups in India, although there is evidence that some lower prevalence districts or states have had small increases in HIV prevalence. Statistical analyses suggest some of these declines may be due to scale-up of key population targeted interventions, and although prevalence may have been decreasing anyway in some of those states, and it's hard to understand exactly why that was. Now, modelling suggested that HIV transmission is driven by sex workers in southern India, and that recent scale-up of sex worker and MSM targeted interventions has decreased overall HIV transmission. So in a way, this gives a picture that there is decrease in HIV prevalence trends and that this could be due to key population interventions. But it's important to note that these analyses weren't covering the whole of India, but specifically looking at southern India, where the larger decreases in HIV prevalence were occurring. And it doesn't give reasons for the possible increase in HIV prevalence in some of the lower prevalence districts. And here's the people that helped in the Avahan project and giving me the data for these analyses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we will take 1 or 2 questions for this presentation. And we'll, as I mentioned before, we'll keep some time at the end of the session for further discussion. So if you could, before asking the question, if you could just introduce yourself.
I'm Dick Grimes from University of Texas. And you showed us several slides suggesting in various population groups prevalence had declined by about 50%. And the only way that I can think of that could happen would be is half of the infected people died and there was no incidence. It's the only way the prevalence can go down. And so I don't understand how you can make any conclusions from your declines in prevalence unless you can demonstrate that.
So the high-risk groups for sex workers, IDUs, and for MSM, people don't remain in those high-risk groups for that long, so there is quite substantial turnover, so you can get quite rapid decreases in HIV prevalence. And amongst the ANC, the decrease in HIV prevalence wasn't as large as 50%.
There's got to be something the matter with your measurement unless you can demonstrate that there's no incidence and 50% mortality.
That you don't need 50% mortality because these say for sex workers, they're only practicing sex work for about 5 years.
You got 5 years worth of data here. You showed us 5 years worth of data.
Yeah. So over 5 years, you'll have a complete turnover of the population.
Okay. And ANC doesn't change any either?
Well, ANC is more of a measure of recent infection.
And
because
MSMs doesn't change? MSMs change?
Well, it's high-risk MSM.
Okay.